I've received messages during the task force from Black people all around the world, from South Africa, from Suriname in South America, parts of Africa, other parts of Africa, inspired by this work and kind of wanting to learn how, they can do something similar in their nations.
Mm. Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us today on the journey towards self-mastery. Our next guest is an activist, a Black internationalist, an attorney, and chair of the California Task Force for Reparations. She has a political science degree from UCLA. She has a Juris Doctor's degree from Columbia Law School. She's a reparatory justice scholar and has dedicated her time and energy to propose remedies for the injustices that Black people have faced in this country and globally. Let's welcome today Miss Kamilah Moore to the program. Miss Moore, it is an honor to have you on the program. I've been waiting for this for a while.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, the honor is all mine. I first heard about you from one of our listeners that was telling me about this whole new California task force that was coming about for reparations. And it was around the time when we were actually interviewing Dr. William Darity on the program that I learned about your work and then, started looking into it and things like that. So, yeah, it's very, very interesting. And I think we're going to have a really interesting dialogue today.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So just for clarity, I know people have a different understandings of what it is when we talk about reparations and what that means, just, on a holistic level. So in your view, like what exactly does reparations mean and how is it looked at from like a worldly view and not just like these individual spaces, but what is reparations in a worldly context? And then when we look at reparations here, Black people that have ancestry that experienced slavery, the whole 40 acres and a mule was promised and that never came about. And, some people say, well, that was the past, like, let's move on kind of thing. So why do you think that reparations is still relevant, even though it's something that was promised so long ago? So first, what is your idea of what reparations is and why is it still relevant?
Sure. So most Americans, when they think about reparations, they just think about cash or, compensation. But under, an international legal perspective, that's kind of the vantage point that I have arrived to study reparations from. For instance, I studied abroad at the University of Amsterdam, received a master's in international criminal law, wrote a thesis on global reparatory justice for people of African descent. So under international human rights law, there is an actual legal definition for reparations. And under international law, reparations should come in 5 forms. So compensation or cash payments is one of those 5 forms. The other 4 forms include, for instance, rehabilitation. So, that could look like, practically speaking, free, subsidized, culturally informed, for instance, mental health services. Restitution is another form of reparations under international law. So practically speaking, that could look like, land restitution, movements to restore stolen land via racially motivated eminent domain, right, as a practical example of what restitution could look like. Satisfaction is another form of reparations under international law. And that's more symbolic, right? That entails, for instance, a formal apology from, the state or the offending party to the injured or aggrieved group.
This quick question while you're there, right there on the formal apology. Why would a formal apology be important from a legal standpoint?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's important from a legal standpoint, a formal apology, because it really sets the foundation for more substantive repair to follow, right? If the state doesn't acknowledge the harm and then doesn't apologize for the harm, right, it's going to be pretty hard to hold them accountable to actually do something for the harm. So, acknowledgement and a formal apology on behalf of the state or the offending party is really a prerequisite for the other 4 forms to follow, like compensation, restitution, rehabilitation. And then the 5th form of reparations under international law is guarantees of non-repetition, which is actually probably the hardest, most difficult form of reparations to achieve, right? Because you're essentially, requiring the offending party to guarantee to stop the harm, right? And that really entails really structural and institutional, policy changes and reforms. So it can get pretty deep.
Got it. So, some people might say, oh man, here we go again. Like, you people are always asking for a handout, and this happened so long ago, this whole slavery thing. This is 2024. What do you guys still want with this whole thing? So why is this still important today?
Yeah, well, reparations is not just about slavery. I don't want to trivialize slavery. Slavery is definitely the foundation for the reparations claim for African Americans who were descendants of slaves. But reparations, particularly in California, most of our recommendations are aimed at eradicating what the task force defined as the lingering badges and incidents of slavery, right? To eradicate the effects of decades of exclusionary public policy that was implemented in this country and in the state of California post-slavery, right? That in several instances hindered the opportunity for African Americans collectively, not individually, but collectively, to build generational wealth. So I'll give a practical example of that. Something that we talked about during the task force is the Federal Homestead Act. And so, for instance, and even Martin Luther King brought this up in some of his last speeches before he was assassinated, right? The Federal Homestead Act was a policy that gave away hundreds of millions of acres of land, pretty much almost for free, to newly arriving immigrants from Europe. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, for instance, America was willing to undergird this newly arriving peasant class from Europe with an economic floor while denying that same opportunity by and large to African Americans. And so the task force, through our work, we discovered there's 46 million people who still benefit from that exclusionary land transfer. That's nearly a quarter of the U.S. population. White folks still benefit from the Federal Homestead Act. And again, that's just one example of an exclusionary public policy that African Americans were not able to benefit from, and really work to hinder, for instance, our ability to build generational wealth. And that's really what reparations is about. It's about rectifying, again, those instances of exclusionary public policy so that we can collectively build generational wealth. Because as it stands right now, white Americans, they have 9 times more assets than Black Americans.
Now, the whole idea of reparations and making it into a legal case is not a new concept. You mentioned that you guys have studied it under the task force, other people that have gone about trying to make this a case. I know you mentioned Johnny Cochran was one of them. So just based on your research and the work that you guys have done, like, what have you found to be some of the reasons that they were not able to really take it really far from, an ideology of establishing it versus implementing it?
It's a really good question. Just the other day, I gave a presentation on the history of, the reparations movement in the United States. And so, for instance, in that presentation, I shared that there were actually ex-slaves, right? People who were actually enslaved. Once they were free, they brought a case before the federal courts called Johnson versus McAdoo. Because the U.S. Treasury Department had collected a cotton tax during slavery that amounted in the amount of $68 million. So post-slavery, that $68 million was literally just floating in the U.S. Treasury Department. They hadn't distributed it yet because they themselves within the Treasury Department were debating kind of the appropriateness of this cotton tax in the first place, right? Federal government taxing these enslavers for the cotton. And so essentially, you had ex-slaves coming together. Callie House, Isaiah Dickerson organized one of the largest grassroots organizations for ex-slaves. They filed a class action lawsuit against the U.S. Treasury Department saying that these ex-slaves were entitled to that $68 million that the Treasury Department was holding. And essentially, the federal courts dismissed the case on procedural grounds, saying that the government was immune, right? You can't sue the government unless the government consents. And they appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with the federal courts. That's just one early instance, right? A lot of people say, well, slavery was so long ago, or you guys should have fought for reparations then. Well, our ancestors did fight for reparations then. They actually had a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, but, it was ultimately dismissed. And then after that, just to conclude, to your point, you had esteemed lawyers like Johnny Cochran, Charles Ogletree, and even before that, human rights lawyers like Paul Robeson, who also went to Columbia Law School like me, William A. Patterson, charging the United States with genocide for crimes against the Negro people because the United Nations Genocide Convention had just became a thing. To summarize, in terms of the history of the reparations movement in the United States, a lot of our ancestors tried to exhaust kind of, the courts. And now, that proved to kind of be unsuccessful. And so now, contemporary activists, they are going through the legislative route. So they are, introducing bills, right, to study and to develop reparations proposals. And then, after that process is over, then they're starting to, for instance, in California, actually introducing reparations bills based on, the task force's study.
That is powerful. That is powerful. All right. So before we get into the task force, I wanted to get a little understanding of you a little bit. And I know part of the task force concept of reparations involves lineage, and family history is a huge part of that. So I've heard you discuss a little bit about your family history and what would make you qualify as well for reparations. So before we get into the task force, can you share your own family history and pretty much what would make you qualify as somebody that would be a recipient of that?
Yes. So, before we get to the task force, in terms of the community of eligibility, the task force stated that, particularly for compensation, if and when that ever becomes a political reality in the state, those who would be eligible would be, descendants of a free or an enslaved Black person living in the United States, right? More broadly,
right,
before 1900. And so that would mean that I would be eligible because, my mother's and my dad's side, they were enslaved in this country, living in this country prior to 1900. So my mom's side, they were enslaved, I think in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. And my dad's side, were enslaved primarily in Louisiana and Texas. Actually, on my dad's side, I actually know the actual plantation or the forced labor camp that my dad's side was forced to labor on. And it's currently called the Whitney Plantation. It's actually a museum now, one of the more prolific slavery museums that's told from the story of the enslaved. Like, it's not a typical kind of like plantation tour, but it used to be called Habitation Heidel. It was owned by, Germans. German folks. So that's kind of my story. Yeah.
Fascinating. All right. So that is interesting. So you did grow up in South Central LA. I'm very curious to get some understanding of how a young girl from South Central LA becomes who you are today. So can you share with us just your life growing up in LA and how you got to where you are now?
Okay, sure. So I grew up in Leimert Park, which is an enclave within South Central LA. And I was raised by, primarily my mother. And she pretty much instilled in me from a very young age, right, to be proud of, my culture, proud of being Black, proud of being African American. I went to a school where, I participated in like oratorical contests. So, I was reading from a very early age, right? Literature, poems, poetry, from people like Maya Angelou, speeches from like Martin Luther King. And so, I kind of internalized that very early on, like this sense of pride. And we always talked about like this concept of like 40 acres and a mule. She learned that from her grandmother, who was a sharecropper in Mississippi. And so, for instance, as a child, I even like would take out and read slave narratives like from the library.
As
Like
a kid.
actually like reading as a kid. I don't know what was up with me, but yeah.
Wow.
So yeah,
So when
it's
did
just
you
always
know
kind of.
that you wanted to have a career in social justice?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know if I think it just social justice kind of like chose me. Like for instance, in fourth grade, like I went to like a public school. They had like free lunch, and it was kind of unhealthy. So like I went to my best friend at the time, who I'm still really close with, and I asked her if she could help me write a petition to get a salad bar at our schools.
Wow.
So like I kind of always have
When you
kind
guys
of
got it?
and fought. Yeah, and we got it. We got it the next week. So yeah, I've always kind of had that sense of like, let's fight the power. Let's, the sense of like fighting for the underdog. And so, yeah, that stayed with me ever since I was a kid. And so I went to UCLA for undergrad. I was really active with political activism there for people of marginalized communities. I was the chairperson of the African Student Union. But and then I took a year and a half off between undergrad and law school because I really didn't know what I wanted to do. But I knew I wanted to eventually go to law school to, study this concept of reparations, right? I understood reparations is generally seen as like a fringe idea. It's kind of seen as an unserious concept. So that's really what motivated me to go to law school because, I wanted to use my legal degree to, come at this concept from a more serious angle.
Right, right. Did you have any inspirations from the Black Panthers, being that they started in California when you were growing up?
Oh yeah, that's it. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, as chair of the African Student Union, we actually have a history of Black Panthers in LA actually being students at UCLA. So, for instance, as a chair of the African Student Union, we every year we would commemorate Bunchy Carter and John Huggins, who were two members of the LA Black Panther Party, who were also students at UCLA through this special program called the High Potential Program that doesn't exist anymore, but it was a way to people from South Central who show high potential and they would come to UCLA, they would pass ethnic studies courses, and if they did good, then they would become actual full-time students. So that was a program in the 60s that was created by, actual students, Black students from UCLA. So essentially, we commemorate them because they were actually shot down on UCLA's campus on Campbell Hall. It's a long story, but the FBI was involved in everything, and so yeah, every year we commemorate them. We bring back, for instance, John Huggins' living widow, Erica Huggins. I've had conversations with, for instance, other women in the Black Panther Party as well. So yeah, I'm definitely inspired by them.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
And I talk to Bobby Seale, who's the co-founder of the Black Panther
Oh
Party. Like I
man,
literally have his number. We
I gotta link up with you, man, because I sent Bobby Seale like 1,000 messages for to come on the podcast. So that would be pretty.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But we'll talk about that after. So you did some time in college, like looking into a thesis that involved international, reparations and things like that. So what brought that about, and what did you kind of gain from learning about just some of the international issues that exist in the world for Black people?
Yeah. So I wrote a thesis on global reparatory justice for people of African descent while I was at Amsterdam Law School to obtain that that LLM, that Master of Laws degree in international criminal law. And for that thesis, I primarily focused on reparatory justice for Black Americans, also Black Brazilians, and Black Colombians, because I was trying to make this kind of novel argument that these three groups are very similar in the sense that, we're all, these three groups, descendants of enslaved Africans who are still, in a sense, living in their former slave societies, still disenfranchised, like in that sense, right? There's never been a Black Colombian president. Well, now there's a Black Colombian vice president, but there's never been like a Black Colombian president. There's never been, a Black Brazilian president, right? Over 200 years post slavery. And yes, Barack Obama is the first Black president, but there has never been, a president who was a descendant of slaves in these states. So I was just making a novel argument that, these three groups, we are disenfranchised still, within our former slave societies. But I'm just focused on those groups, because there was like a page limit. But I'm deeply passionate about reparatory justice for all people of African descent. We are all very much so entitled to, repair.
Agreed.
And sorry, I forgot to answer the last part. In terms of like the international legal precepts, I learned about, I applied, for instance, the concept of crimes against humanity, right? That there's a particular legal definition under international law about what constitutes crimes against humanity. And I was making novel arguments that, slavery and some of its after effects, right, constituted crimes against humanity. How can we hold states accountable to this day for that? What are the limitations under international law in doing that? Like, for instance, the idea of statute of limitations, right? These are things that are thrown at us all the time, right? You can't, hold states accountable for slavery, right? Because of statute of limitations or, other kind of procedural issues. So that whole paper, I was just kind of having a conversation with myself, I guess, making arguments for global repair, but also kind of acknowledging and making counter arguments for some of the procedural counterpoints for people who kind of talk against reparations.
Interesting. Okay. So why the California Task Force? Did you apply for it? Was it recommended to you? How did that all go about, and how did you become the chair?
Yeah, so I graduated from law school in 2019 in New York City. I moved back to LA right after for work. You had, the racial reckoning of, the George Floyd, situation 2020, which in a sense propelled California Governor Newsom, to sign the reparations bill into law September 30th, 2020. Right. So less than a year after I graduated from law school, this was this opportunity that opened up to be a part of this first in the nation task force. And so anyone in the state of California could actually apply because this task force is like any other state commission, right? That covers, different policies. Like there's a water commission, right? This commission so happened to be about reparations. So again, anyone in the state of California could apply. I read through the statute that created the task force, and there was a provision in there that said, whoever's on the task force, the final recommendations must comport with international human rights law standards. And so I was like, oh, bingo, like that is what I'm going to use as leverage to make myself a competitive candidate for this commission. And so also in that statute, it told you who would be responsible for appointing the folks on the task force. So Governor Newsom had 5 appointees. The Speaker of the State Assembly had 2 appointees, and the Speaker of the State Senate had 2. So I applied to all 3 to kind of increase my chances, right? But ultimately, the person who reached out to me first with an offer was the Speaker of the State Assembly, Anthony Rendon. So that's how I got on the commission. And then our first hearing, we had an opportunity to elect amongst ourselves as the 9 task force members who would be the chairperson. And I think I was the only one that came prepared with a speech with reasoning for why I should be the chairperson. And so that is ultimately how I became the chair. I was selected by my fellow task force members to do so.
Yeah. That is impressive. That is very impressive. Especially, by the way, like some people might think that you guys were paid for this, and there's some like there was no payment, and you you applied an infinite amount of hours to this thing. So kudos to you for like putting in that work for the culture, for the benefit of Black people, without worrying about how big your check was going to be. So I definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, it's completely free. It was a public service. We were not allowed to get paid at all from the state or even for speaking engagements as well. Yeah, it was literally a labor of love. I even, quit my job a year in just to primarily focus
Wow.
on leading this task force. So,
Wow.
yeah.
How did you survive quitting it? I'm just curious, like how did you like
I had savings to stay with my parents. I made it work,
by any
so.
means necessary? I got you.
Yeah.
All right.
And then once the task force was winding down, I just, got back into the job market and, now I'm working full time again. Yeah.
Perfect. I mean, obviously that would not be difficult for someone of your caliber. Columbia University, that's the easy one right there. So I am curious also, outside of just you, there is somebody on the task force that is not Black. So what went into the decision of having somebody outside of the Black community on the task force? What's the logic behind that?
Yeah, so the member you're talking about is Task Force member Don Tamaki. He's Japanese American. And I actually learned recently on a panel that I was with him on, he actually did not apply to be on the task force. He was just straight out appointed by Governor Newsom. I don't know the rationale behind that, but he served as a really good task force member. If people don't know much about Don Tamaki, his family, his mother and father, they were victims of the internment of the U.S. federal government, right? So his family was interned in barracks. Because Japanese, after the attack of Pearl Harbor, were treated as aliens, as criminals, and they were all rounded up right in these barracks. And so he also he's an attorney. So he was also responsible for being a part of the team to overturn a court case called Korematsu versus the United States. And that case was a case that pretty much justified the internment of Japanese Americans, calling them alien. So it was a symbolic measure, right? Because the internment had already ended, right, decades ago. But, he was a part of that team to overturn that case. And so, yeah, I don't know necessarily the rationale for why Newsom appointed him, but I think, it was a smart appointment because, Black folks in California, we only represent 6% of the state's population. I believe Asian Californians represent over 12%. And so, in order for reparations to actually become a reality, right, Black people, we can't do this alone, right? We're going to need, all hands on deck. And that definitely includes, the Asian American community. So he's been doing some really great work, making sure that this fight is multicultural.
Got it. I know some Black people would not agree with that multicultural word, but
Yeah.
going
Diplomat.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, when you look at the percentage of Black people, even if all the Black people in the world said, like, well, not in the world, but in the United States said that, they wanted reparations, it wouldn't be enough to get a vote out there to pass it. So you are absolutely right. So looking at the task force, you all did quite a bit of work. You've interviewed a number of people. You got experts from all different areas, all different fields that you've spoken to, from all different, platforms and things like that. And you got organized a document looking at 13 essential categories for reparations and everything. So just from that experience, what do you feel that you have kind of learned, or some of the highlights of talking to so many different people about this reparations in California?
So in terms of expert witnesses, oh my God, we heard from over 150 expert witnesses, to your point, on these, 13 major areas of systemic discrimination, including obviously slavery. And I think some of the highlights for the expert witnesses, Professor Stacy Smith, her name comes to mind. She's a professor at Oregon State University. And she helped us to disrupt this myth and this narrative that California was a free state or that California never had slavery. She was one of our first expert witnesses. Her life's work in the academy is around, right, disrupting this myth. So, for instance, we learned from her that there were over, 2,000 Black folks that were enslaved in the state. Not as much, Black folks that were enslaved in the South, but, one is still too many, right? You had enslavers literally transporting their slaves from the South to California, particularly during the gold rush, right? To, mine for gold. These are things I didn't learn in elementary school,
I don't think
right?
any of us.
Fourth grade is right. But fourth grade is when we learn all about the gold rush, but we didn't learn about that.
We're always
at
left
all.
out. Always left out.
Right. Or for instance, right, California, even though it was so-called free state, right? So in the Constitution, it didn't deliberately allow for it, right? They still allowed it. And they also implemented a fugitive slave law, right? 2 years after they were admitted into the Union in 1852. So, practically that meant California was not a sanctuary state for runaway enslaved people. So if you're a runaway and you wanted to go to California for refuge, via that act, right, ordinary white citizens would deputize themselves, right, or law enforcement would round you up, right, and have you deported to go back to the South to be re-enslaved, or in some instances enslaved on California soil. Also, there were slave colonies in California, like in San Bernardino, in Southern California. There were slaves all over the state, actually. So that's really one of the expert witnesses, and that really comes to mind in terms of the work that was really interesting. Like, I didn't know any of this until I was on the task.
Yeah, that is interesting. So, everybody wants to know, how are we going to get these payments? How are we going to get this out? So in a 5-4 vote, you guys all chose lineage-based payments versus race-based. So what went into the lineage-based versus race-based? And then we all know the history of some of these things, looking into like Native Americans and stuff like that, would keep somebody that maybe identifies as white that says, oh yeah, I had ancestors before 1900 that were slaves, and I want to apply for this lineage-based payment plan, like whatever it turns out to be. What would prevent that from happening? So first, let's break down lineage versus race-based and what went into you guys picking lineage-based.
Right. So I'll just address this question from more of a legal standpoint. So first, the debate around, race versus lineage in terms of the cash compensation, it literally lasted like 10 months. Like the task force, we were really wrestling with this concept. Like it really kind of like almost led to a fissure, right, within the task force around this idea. I will say the author of the bill, Shirley Weber, she was in the state assembly, but now she's California's first African-American Secretary of State. We brought her back into the conversation, asked her to be an expert witness to help us. Well, what do you advise, Secretary Weber? Who did you have in mind, rather, when you authored this bill? And so she was a proponent for lineage-based reparations. And so, she was advising us to go with a lineage-based framework rather than a race-based framework. But, most of the task force members were still kind of grappling with it. So then we ended up inviting Dean Erwin Chemerinsky. He's the dean of UC Berkeley Law School. So we invited him to give us expert testimony because he's a constitutional law scholar, right? When you go to law school, literally all the constitutional law textbooks are written by him, right? So he's one of the most preeminent constitutional law scholars in the country. And so we brought him in to give expert testimony. That was in 2022. And he actually predicted, well, first he suggested, he advised that we go with the lineage-based framework rather than a race-based framework for a couple of reasons. One, because race-based affirmative action has been illegal in the state of California since 1996. So California we haven't been able to use race-based affirmative action in the areas of education, contracting, and employment since Proposition 209 passed. And then also he predicted the outcome of the Supreme Court case on June 29, 2023. So he predicted in 2022 that the Supreme Court was going to strike down race-conscious affirmative action under a diversity rationale in higher education. And he said that that is going to have implications for this work. And so in light of that prediction, right, he advised us to go with the lineage-based framework. And he was right? They did strike down race-based remedies, race-based affirmative action. That is, one of the reasons from a legal standpoint why we went with the lineage framework. Now, to the last point. I know you said you invited Dr. Darity to speak, and I'm sure he told you about his two-pronged test for eligibility for reparations in his book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And his eligibility test it's a two-pronged test. It's a race factor and a lineage factor. So under his test, you're eligible for reparations if you're a descendant of someone who was enslaved in this state. So that's a race neutral, well, not race neutral, but lineage factor. And then you also had to identify as Black on government forms for the past 10 to 12 years. Well, when we talked to Chemerinsky, he was pretty much saying that racial component of having to identify as Black or African American might be deemed as suspicious by the courts. The courts are very conservative and hostile right now to anything racial, which is really unfortunate. And so I'm kind of giving you a long answer because I'm trying to avoid the reality, which could be under a pure lineage framework. There could be people who don't presently identify as Black who could actually still be eligible for cash payments if, in fact, they can identify someone who was enslaved in their lineage. That's actually what Chemerinsky kind of soberingly also alluded to.
Very, very interesting. If it's something that happens, I could definitely see other people outside of Black people benefiting or trying to benefit from that. And then it would have to be changed, or we would have to refigure that out. But you have mentioned the Black population in California is only 6%, which means that we need other people in order for this to actually happen and occur. But a lot of people outside of the Black community oppose the whole concept of reparations, especially as it relates to cash payments. So how do you convince people outside the Black community that this is the right thing, or that they should be paying for something they did not do, they weren't a part of, and they shouldn't have to worry about paying for something like this, even though they pay for a whole bunch of other stuff and their taxes that they don't complain about? But that's a whole nother story. How do you convince that other 94% of the population?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This scholar named Dr. Derek Bell, he came up with this concept, pretty much called interest convergence. He's African American, Black. And, he pretty much said, like, decades ago, like, Black people, we're not going to get anything done in this country unless we can convince that it also helps white people too. Like, all of our gains from, like, being emancipated from slavery or even getting civil rights, like, when you understand, like, the rationale for how those things came to be, it was via interest convergence. It wasn't because, white folks kind of like felt it in their heart at that particular time. This concept of interest convergence, like, you saw, Abraham Lincoln, for instance, like, you hear that story all the time. He didn't want to free the slaves because he liked us. He wanted to save the Union. So that's a primary example of interest convergence. And so I think from a communications perspective, there needs to be more arguments around how reparations is not about preferential treatment, right, for one group. It's about making sure, guaranteeing that all groups are treated equally. And the data clearly shows that Black Americans, they're presently not being, treated equally. And all of society benefits when we're all treated equally. But that's more of a weaker argument. On another point, there was a poll that came out from Berkeley's Intergovernmental Studies that you just cited, where they said 59% of those polled, they polled 6,000 California voters, and they kind of extrapolated that to say, that represents, the state of California. They said 59% of those polled were against cash payments. Most of that 59% were Republicans, right? Democrats were in favor of it, I think 43%, but that's still kind of low. But what I wanted to point out, though, in that same polling of the 6,000 people, even though the majority said they were against cash payments, the majority also said that the state of California was doing not enough for Black people. And the majority of those same people polled said that they understand that the legacy of slavery still impacts Black Californians. And so, I saw those two kind of like, okay, glimmers of hope, right? People understand there's a problem here. They might not agree that cash is the solution, but they at least understand that the state's not doing enough for Black folks, and that the legacy of slavery still persists. So we can work with that, right? And that's literally what's happening, right? We have 19 bills out right now. None of them are, directly cash payments related, but, they're all working to address that legacy of slavery that the majority of Californians understand needs to be eradicated.
Right. On your social media, you posted a documentary on ABC looking at the reparations going on in California. I checked it out. It was really good.
Oh, nice.
And one of the things I noticed in the documentary that was mentioned was that, if this does pass, it can cost California, the state, over $800 billion. And I know people are worried about, well, I don't want to pay for that. I want that coming out of my taxes. So where does that 800, I know you guys made recommendations on, where this money comes from. So where does $800 billion comes from? Where does that come from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was actually talking about this earlier in a sense. So before I get to that, San Francisco had its own reparations task force. And they actually recommended that all Black San Franciscans get $5 million, but they didn't really hire any experts to help them come up with that number. They just kind of arbitrarily came up with the number of 5 million, citing, the cost of living in San Francisco is really high. Like, we're being pushed out, 5 million, that'll be sufficient for us to, stay and thrive here, which is fine. Fair enough. But the California Reparations Task Force, we kind of took a different approach. None of the our task force members were economists. Jovan Scott Lewis actually does have some training in economics. But, we understood that part is a little bit above our pay grade, but we knew we had the duty as part of the statute to seriously consider compensation. And so we actually hired 5 economists and public policy experts to help us, essentially gather data to help us come up with a claim or an argument for what, if anything, the state of California owes descendants of slaves for systemic discrimination. So, we only had 2 years to do this work. We hired these economists like almost a year into our work. Some of those economists included Dr. William Darity. So he was one of our economists that we hired. Dr. William Spriggs, who's the Dean of Economics at Howard. He actually passed away before our last hearing. Mm-hmm. He was on our economics team. And so essentially, in the limited time that these economists had, they were able to find data to show that the state of California was culpable in discrimination in 5 areas: health harms, devaluation of Black businesses, unjust property takings, housing segregation, and mass incarceration and over-policing. And so within each of those areas, they made an argument for, how and why compensation should be owed to descendants of slaves for each of those areas, which in total equal to $800 billion, which is, matter of fact, 3 times the annual budget of the state of California. So it is a pretty astronomical number. But, that's the numbers that even Don Tamaki said that. He said, we can't shy away from that number, right? That's the number that the economists came up with. That's what they stated, the California worked to dispossess Black Americans from. So for instance, Jovan Scott Lewis, just to conclude, he, articulated this very well in justifying this $800 billion sum, right? We were saying, we're not actually recommending the state give money to Black people. We're recommending the state return money to Black people, return monies dispossessed via racially motivated eminent domain or via racially restrictive covenants and redlining, right? And housing segregation, right? All of these, or devaluation of Black businesses, right? All of these instances that have prohibited and prevented Black Californians from accumulating, generational wealth.
Right. So let's imagine that, Black people in California do get reparations. They get a cash payment. I've heard a lot of activists say that, look, if you give Black people reparations, they're going to go buy Jordans. They're going to go and put money, right back into white people's pockets anyway. So it's going to benefit white people. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that has some validity, or do you think that Black people would handle the money responsibly?
I mean, part of me says, if that's what they want to do with the money that they're rightfully owed, go ahead. And that also kind of goes back into the idea of interest convergence. Like, hey, that's why white people, y'all should, right? That's why y'all should support it, right? Somebody's got to go back to you, right? Come on. Part of it also, if this happens, right, there has to be ongoing education with the community. I'm not going to infantilize the community and say, oh, y'all need we need financial literacy before we get a cash payment. No, because there's actually data to show that Black people, with the little money that we do have, we actually don't spend it frivolously, despite what the media portrays. Most of us, we spend our money on necessities, right? Just getting by. And so, I have faith that, if and when this becomes a political reality, people are going to use it responsibly, whatever that means. But, the jury's out on that. I don't really have strong feelings on that, other than I do think that there should be, ongoing education amongst the community about why reparations is important, what's it for, and how we can best kind of utilize it once it becomes a reality.
Great points. In the beginning, you mentioned about this coming about as a result of the George Floyd murder and, people's response to that. So some people say like, well, they knew Black people were real upset at that point and they wanted to do something to ease Black people, to please Black people, but they don't really plan on, doing anything physically past this, advisory committee of advising what to do, but not really doing anything. What are your thoughts about people that say that this was just put in place to calm Black people's minds and to make them think that something was going to come out of this whole situation during George Floyd? What are your thoughts about that?
No, I understand and appreciate that point, but just to color that point a little bit more, yes, this, we do have to give credit to George Floyd and, that situation for kind of propelling, for instance, Governor Newsom, I think, to sign the legislation. But before, he was murdered, there were grassroots activists on the ground, working with then Assemblymember Shirley Weber on this, right? The idea of this bill, right, came actually before George Floyd. So I'm saying all that to say, these grassroots activists, they're still on the ground now, right? Holding, elected officials accountable to make sure that, reparations actually becomes a reality, to make sure that it's not just a fluke. And that's happening across the country, right? Illinois is the second state to have the Reparations Task Force. New York is the third. They're about to convene their commission. So the cat is out of the box.
You guys opened it up.
I don't know. No turning back now.
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as the task force goes, in a perfect world, if everything goes according to plan and you kind of get everything that you asked for, that you put together in that document, what exactly do you think the impact would be for Black Californians?
The impact would be magnificent. Not only for Black Californians, for all Californians. Because when Black Californians are lifted up, all Californians are going to benefit again, from an international legal perspective, reparations comes in those 5 forms, and you can't really call call a program reparations unless it fully comports and includes all 5 of those
Right.
forms. And so, in a perfect world, we would have all 19 of these bills that are introduced, passing, but also in addition to that, we will have a direct cash payments bill. I'm hoping to see a direct cash payments bill in the next legislative session. Hopefully we'll see. But yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, reparations is, I see it as truly uplifting the Black American community, the Black community in general, in all aspects, materially, economically, psychologically, as well.
Interesting. So another component of the task force, people were very upset about that. Well, they're just focusing on the lineage and Black Americans. What about the immigrants? What about other Black people that came later on? And we should be looking at it holistically. And, I understand why you all look at it like that, because you have to deal with it from a legal standpoint. But a lot of people don't understand that.
Mm-hmm.
So can you touch
Yeah.
on that and touch on how this can actually have an impact on Black people from a global perspective, and the advice that you would have for Black people in Haiti? I'm Haitian. You mentioned that there are some grievances that Haiti has with the United States from a legal standpoint. So, what advice would you have for outside countries in regards to how to maneuver this thing called reparations in their countries, and then how does it benefit other Black people other than the lineage-based Black people?
So the task force, we, in our final report, we recommended over 115 policy recommendations. Many of them are universal in nature, so they would actually benefit all Californians, no matter the race. A kind of one nominal one I'll bring up for a practical example is like, one of our recommendations is kind of funny, was, let's make Election Day a paid holiday. That would benefit all Californians because all Californians would have the day off. But the reason why we put that in the report, is to address like this history of political disenfranchisement of Black folks. But a lot of our recommendations, contrary to popular belief, are actually race-based. So they're going to benefit all Black people. There's no lineage requirement. One of the practical recommendations that are race-based from our report, we recommended the creation of Black wellness centers in the Black community, right, to address, mental and public health concerns within the Black community, right? There's no lineage requirement for something like that. Or we recommended that the state end slavery in prisons, right? The California Constitution allows that, right? That would impact everyone who's incarcerated positively, not just, Black Americans. But to your point, for the compensation kind of related recommendations, those are narrowly tailored to descendants of slaves, in part for legal reasons, but also just really to honor this kind of long storied history of this movement of reparations that really started with ex-slaves, and in a sense, their direct descendants are standing in the shoes of their ancestors. But to answer your second point, I see this movement for reparations in California, but also across the United States, if fully achieved and realized, it could become a domino effect that gives inspiration to other Black folks in the diaspora on the continent of Africa and around the world to do something similar. They might have their own unique struggles. They probably won't have to deal with kind of the constitutional kind of lineage versus race issues that, we have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
But, I really do see this as sparking, inspiration. And in fact, I've received messages during the task force from Black people all around the world, from South Africa, from Suriname in South America, parts of Africa, other parts of Africa, inspired by this work and kind of wanting to learn how, they can do something similar in their nations.
Man, inspiring the world. That is amazing. So your work with the task force is completed. You've done what you need to do with that. What is the next mission for you? What does the future look like?
Yes, so the task force, we completed our work June 2023. And so now, in our official role, we were a state legislative advisory commission or body. So our official role was to advise the state legislature on the types of reparations proposals that they should adopt into law. And so we did that, right? We advised them through producing this 1,100-page final report with over 115 recommendations, to which they should now be introducing legislation based on those over 100 recommendations. And in this session, this current legislative session, they've introduced about 19 bills based on those 100 recommendations. And so in terms of what's next for me, it's continuing the conversation, right? For podcasts like these and other, engagements, just sharing and spreading the gospel, right? Sharing, the work of the task force, what we discuss, what we decided, giving updates about what's happening now in terms of the legislation, and then helping to organize to ensure that these bills pass.
Amazing. All right. So before we wrap up, I wanted to do a quick little activity called What's Your Favorite? Just identifying a few of your favorite things before we wrap up. So I know you've studied a lot of Black history. What's your favorite time period to look at in Black history?
I like pre-colonial Africa. I like learning a bit about that. I like what was Africa like, kind of like before colonization. But if we're talking about the United States, the civil rights movement, I think, is the 1960s, and 70s. The work of Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, even Martin Luther King. And I'm not talking about superficially. I'm talking about digging really deep into their philosophies. Like, for instance, Malcolm X, he was assassinated on the day that he was giving his speech to create a new organization, right? He had left the Nation of Islam to create a new organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And if he were to have lived, right, that organization was aimed at getting Black folks in the Americas to be united first, right? African Americans in the United States, then we're supposed to collaborate with Afro-Americans or Black folks in Haiti, right? Black folks in other parts of the Caribbean, Black folks in South America. We're all supposed to come together, collaborate together. And then Malcolm X's strategy was for the Organization of Afro-American Unity to then collaborate with the AU, the African Union, right? So, yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Thank you for that history lesson.
Kind of learning.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, look it up. Look up the full organization. His sister was helped him with it. It's a lot of good history. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. What is your favorite thing about law?
It could be used as a tool. Like, I'm using, my legal degree as a tool, right? As a set of tools, really, to kind of like push this issue forward. So using my law degree for strategic litigation for reparations, but there are other reparations advocates like Deidre Farmer-Pellman, Johnny Cochran, Charles Ogletree that have utilized strategic litigation, right? Their law degrees in that sense, right? I'm using my law degree as a tool to push legislation, to push reparations through a legislative kind of avenue. There's other ways that you can kind of use the law to, achieve kind of your social justice purposes. I don't know. Sorry.
Got you. What was your favorite part of being a member of the task force?
Learning from the people, like hearing the stories of Black Californians and kind of the harms they endured. But just my favorite part was not hearing that, obviously, but my favorite part was cultivating a space for them to be heard. I really, truly valued, that. So, for instance, I was, led the charge to extend the time for public comment. Usually it was like an hour, but I was like, this is not sufficient. Like, people are literally pouring their hearts out to us. An hour is not enough. I was tired of seeing people turned away sad because they couldn't share what they've gone through. So, we extended the public comment for 2 hours. We coordinated listening sessions because, again, just to conclude from an international legal perspective, when we're talking about reparations, it's the aggrieved group, it's the injured group that really should be leading this conversation and discussing like what repair looks like to them. So it's really awkward, and it's not enough for like this 9-member commission to be kind of sitting elevated and like dictating and determining what reparations should look like for the aggrieved group. It should be much more collaborative in nature at the very least, but it really should be the aggrieved group driving it. So I was trying to structure our hearings to make sure that was possible.
Got it. What would you say is your favorite book on reparations or justice?
On reparations or justice, Steve Biko, I Like What I Write. He was a South African anti-apartheid activist. I read his book while I was in college, and it really still sits with me. For instance, how he talked about how Black people, what is our gift to this world? And he said it's our humanity, right? We can teach people how to be more humane, right? And so that really stuck with me. In terms of reparations, there's this book, but it wasn't actually written by a reparationist, but it's a book about a reparationist. So the book is called My Face is Black is True. It's about Callie House. It's about the ex-slave that I talked about earlier, who led a movement to secure reparations for ex-slaves. She brought that class action case, Johnson versus McAdoo. And Callie House was actually charged with mail fraud by the federal government. Because they stated that she was defrauding her members of the organization, saying that reparations was such a pipe dream that would never happen on the federal level. And so you were essentially defrauding your members by, telling them to pay into this organization so that you can advocate on their behalf. And so the FBI and the post office, the federal post office, charged her with mail fraud. She was convicted by all white male jury, so not by a jury of her peers. And she was actually incarcerated for a year. She was released. She died from cervical cancer, and her organization pretty much was destroyed. So, yeah, that book by Mary Frances Berry about her life is very interesting, and it's one of my favorite books for obvious reasons.
All right, I got some reading to do.
And I can't forget Dr. Martin Luther King's last book before he passed away. I haven't actually read the full book, but his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? He talks about, kind of reparations and this idea of, African Americans and our kind of identity as being, yes, descendants of slaves, but also, coming from a great heritage in Africa as well.
Man, I got some reading to do, man. Those sound very, interesting. So I gotta get up on that. Okay.
Start with I Like What I. Yeah, start with I Write What I Like by Steve Biko.
Steve Biko,
selective writing. So
we'll do. Favorite person that you would like to have a conversation with, dead or alive?
Martin Luther King Jr. And that sounds superficial, but he was super deep. Like, he was so deep. Like, I would love to have a conversation with him. But honestly, Vice Chair Amos Brown, so the vice chair of the California Reparations Task Force, he's a pastor in San Francisco. He actually was taught by Martin Luther King. He was one of only 16 students who were taught by Martin Luther King when he attended Morehouse Seminary. So when I talk to Dr. Brown, I do kind of feel like I'm a little close to kind of having that conversation with Dr. King.
That's dope. All right. And last one, favorite life gem that you've ever got from anybody. So words of wisdom or words about life that you were able to implement.
Block out the noise and just have faith and, just do your thing. Forget the haters.
Yo, that's good. You definitely had to use that one. I'll tell you. You had to use that one.
It's harder said than done, I'm telling you.
Yo, kudos. And I was talking about this before the program that, I've looked at some of the videos and the recordings of the task force meetings and stuff like that, where you getting yelled at and called names and all type of things, and you remain professional, courteous and all that stuff. And I'm like, yo, this is dope. This is how we should be doing it. It could have easily been a back and forth thing, and it could have been like, look at these clowns on the task force and them arguing about nonsense and this and that and the third. But you maintain your composure, and you guys were able to get through those moments. So kudos to you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I personally think that the work that you've done will give you a spot in the history books. I don't know about their history books, but our history books, for sure. And, it's monumental And you are doing some great things, and you have done some great things for the Black collective. And like you said, people are being inspired all over the world, and new task forces are coming up. And then hopefully, through this, some things will actually come out, physically things will come out of this whole experience. But when you look at your legacy and what you want to leave behind with the work that you've done with justice, with reparations and law and everything, like what is it exactly that you want people to remember about Kamilah Moore?
That I care about, Black people, all Black people, that I'm strategic about what that care looks like is also kind of what I want folks to take away from my legacy, kind of similar to Malcolm X and, the creation of the OAAU, right? His ultimate goal was full Pan-African unity with all African people. But there was a way that he went about it, right? With that organization, he felt first, African Americans, we have to get our house together.
Mm-hmm.
Then, other folks in the Americas, right, have to get their house together. Then we have to all come together to get all our, together. And then we need to, go to the African Union and work together to, get all of our houses in order in a sense. So, I'm inspired kind of by that strategic vision of, global Black unity. So, I hope to kind of be seen in that light, continuing that vision.
Indeed. I think it will be a reality. I'm inspired. I hope everybody listening is inspired. Before we leave off, can you leave us with your favorite quote and what it means to you?
Oh, well, I like Bob Marley's song War, which is a quote from one of the speeches from Haile Selassie, right? Where he's like, until the philosophy that says one race is superior and another is inferior, there will always be war. So I like that whole song. I would say that we gotta change all that up. Like we can't, buy into these precepts of superiority and inferiority. And so, yeah, I like that. That's the song that's in my head, the quote that's in my head.
Yeah, that is a powerful song. One of my favorites too by Bob Marley. Man, it's been a pleasure. We got some law, we got some history, we got some reparations, we got a little bit of everything from you, Kamilah. I appreciate, your time and energy. And where can people find you that are interested in getting information or just reaching out?
Yes, so I do have a website, KamilahMoore.com, and I have presentations, like PowerPoint presentations on that website as well under the education tab, KamilahMoore.com/education. But on social media, across all platforms, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, you can find me, Kamilah V. Moore. Mm-hmm.
There it is. I hope you are inspired like I am inspired. We'll definitely try to get Kamilah back on the program for more. She has a lot to give, a lot of information, and we'll be following along with her work. Listeners, definitely get familiar with the California Task Force and the different task forces that are out there for reparations. Read about it, study it, learn it, and we got to continue this work. And I think, like you've mentioned, it should be a global movement because a lot of us think that we are a certain way because of our ideology or stupidity or whatever people like to say, but there is a reason that things got to be how they are as far as financial, educational, law, like everything. So that is a huge part of it, and we have to look for justice for these things. And I appreciate the work that you guys are doing, and you're raising awareness all over the world that we can't just sit tight and pull ourselves up by the bootstrap. That good old saying, right? Especially when other cultures have benefited from reparations and have benefited from these apologies and justice after injustice was done. So why don't we deserve that? So I appreciate your work. Definitely, listeners, continue looking into that work. And of course, remember, your mind is the most powerful tool in the universe. If you can think it, you can do it. If you believe in it, you can be it. And if you fight for it, you can have it. The world is yours. This has been your host, Mr. G, and I will see you next time on MasterMine.
So every day I'm going hard. I'm talking business, bank accounts, and credit cards. And somehow we defeat the odds and making sure that no one's